Good morning and welcome to the Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, April. We're still in April 29th. I'm Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and glad for those of you who are joining us with this event. We've been with you for more than a month now. We've had events at this series on broadband and the coronavirus, talking about the impacts that broadband has and can have, both as solutions, but also, as we hope we'll talk about today, potential problems and concerns, and the way that technology is in some ways keeping us together at this time of separation and crisis, but also, again, probing some of the issues that arise. Today, we're going to be talking about contact tracing and some of the privacy issues raised by it and perhaps other issues associated with the coronavirus. And we'll be hearing from 2 or 3 experts to talk about this subject. But before we get started, I always like to just start off with a little discussion about the state of the world, if you will, and it's incredibly sobering with 3,193,000 confirmed cases and obviously many more likely cases globally. 218,000 deaths in the United States, 1,014,568 confirmed. Again, that's just the confirmed cases, and 58,000 deaths, more than the entire Vietnam War. So, I mean, this is a huge crisis, and as sort of reality settles in and we don't know how long it's going to go on, there's a lot of discussion now about the kinds of precautions people are going to need to be taking over the next period of time until we have a vaccine or until there's greater certainty about aspects of the disease. One of the issues that's often talked about as a solution is contact tracing. And so we're going to talk about what that means, both in its original sense, epidemiologically, I guess, but also some of the variants that we're seeing with technology and proposals that are out there, both the Apple-Google proposal, but also other types that are out there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to our panel. We're again grateful to have my computer's not reacting instantaneously here. So there we go. Kathryn Waldron, and Kathryn is the director of cybersecurity and other aspects of technology at the R Street Institute. Welcome, Kathryn.
Not the director, just a fellow.
Senior fellow. Okay, my apologies, Kathryn. Thank you for joining us and for being here. And we'll turn to Kathryn first to discuss a little bit about what contact tracing is and how it applies to the digital age. Alan Butler. Alan is the interim president and general counsel of the Electronic Privacy and Information Center. Thank you for joining us, Alan. We appreciate you being here and the perspective that you'll lend to our discussion. We may have another panelist join us here, but let's go ahead and turn to you, Kathryn. If you don't mind telling our readers a little bit about, readers and listeners about what the R Street Institute is and what some of the specific areas that you follow and cover, just as an intro to your discussion of contact tracing, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so the R Street Institute is a conservative libertarian think tank here in DC, and we work on a wide variety of policy areas, but my particular team, the National Security and Cybersecurity team, really looks at the intersection between technology and national security. So some of the areas that I normally follow when we're not in the middle of a global pandemic include concerns about 5G, supply chain risk, cybersecurity in general. So anything along those lines. Now that coronavirus has essentially taken over everyone's concerns, we've been doing a lot of focus on health surveillance and the privacy impacts of COVID-19.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about sort of the vision for contact tracing, what it involves, and how what kind of theoretical promise there might be from the ability to use contact tracing.
Absolutely. So contact tracing is a technique used in the medical community for essentially building out a network of potential contacts that someone who has come down with an infectious disease anyone they may have been in contact with, so that they can alert those people to say, hey, just so you know, you might have been exposed. And so normally this is done manually. A good way to think about this pre-coronavirus would be like a sexual transmitted disease. You might want to notify previous partners, hey, you might have been exposed. And so with coronavirus, if you have been tested positive for coronavirus, then you might be asked by an individual, hey, who have you been in contact with? Who are your family members? Who might you have been essentially around in the past 14 days that we should notify and to say, hey, you might be exposed to COVID-19. Now, there's a couple of different problems with the manual version of contact testing. Essentially, it's not very scalable. So it requires a lot of physical labor. You have to be able to have good testing. And the other problem is that people don't have necessarily great memories. So you may not actually remember everyone that you've been in contact with. You might not actually know people that you were in contact with. Maybe you were at a grocery store and you might have exposed someone, but you don't have their information. You would have no way of remembering who they are. And so there are limitations with the manual version of contact tracing that some people are hoping to resolve by creating a digital version. And so in response to coronavirus, several different governments and companies across the globe have explored the idea of doing an automated version of contact tracing. So in Singapore, they did this with an app that used Bluetooth signals from your device and other people's devices. And so how it works is that your device, if your device is set up, typically that means you've downloaded an app, will keep a log of all the other Bluetooth signals of other devices that you've been in contact with. And then if you later turn out to test positive for COVID-19, you can use that log to say, here's a list of everyone that I've been in physical contact with. And they can get a notification that says, hey, you may have been exposed. Now, there's been different privacy concerns about this, and there's been different approaches. So governments like Singapore have built systems that are considered that have apps that are considered centralized. That is, the data is held in a central depository that's typically held by some government agency, typically a health service agency. That raises concerns, essentially, who is going to have your data, how much data is that invasive. And so there's been a recent announcement by Google and Apple who are collaborating on a decentralized version of this app. And so essentially what would happen is that log of all the different Bluetooth signals that your device has come in contact with, the idea is that instead of being held all together by a central government agency, that record stays on your device. It is anonymized, it is encrypted, and it never leaves your device. And so essentially no one can access that log, and it will delete after, I think, approximately 14 days, which is when symptoms tend to show up for coronavirus. And so if someone you would have to download the app, you have to actually agree to the terms to circumvent privacy laws in the United States. And then your phone would only track the Bluetooth signals of other people who have also agreed to download that app. The problem, though, the beauty of the Bluetooth system is that it's very privacy focused. There are, however, several downsides to this approach as well. One being that it may not actually capture it may not capture other ways of spreading the disease. For example, you may have been somewhere, you may have touched the surface, you may have left, someone else may have come in after you've left and touched the same surface. And so that wouldn't be picked up by Bluetooth signals. There are concerns about whether or not Bluetooth signals are going to be, they're too noisy in a sense. They're going to capture, essentially, they're going to say, hey, you were in contact with this person, when in reality you were far apart. You never were actually in any danger of being exposed to one another. But in general, a lot of people, I think, are excited about the idea of a app that essentially allows you to be notified, because I think a lot of people are sick of being in their homes and looking for ways to reopen the economy.
Great. No, thank you so much for that description, Kathryn. And just to be clear, is there a reason why this needs to be a quote phone, or is there a location component to it, or a not location component? In other words, the way you talked about contact tracing in the traditional sense and the transition over to digital contact tracing, it's almost kind of like we just need something to prompt our memories, right? So is there a linkage here, either in terms of what's been discussed in the Singapore example that you referenced, the thing called the Trace Together, or in terms of other proposals that are out there that do more than just prompt your memory, if you will? Is there like a location component to any of these systems that you've observed, Kathryn?
So with the Bluetooth design, it's not actually designed to capture geolocation data. It's designed to capture proximity data. So it's actually intentionally designed that way. So it doesn't track your location. It just tracks who you may have been in contact with. And that's been designed intentionally to protect your privacy, because I think there are a lot of people who feel like capturing geolocation data would actually be much, much more invasive than just capturing your proximity to another person.
Okay, appreciate that background. Let's turn to you, Alan. Tell us a little bit about the perspective that your organization, Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is kind of the granddaddy of privacy organizations, you've really focused on these issues for decades. Tell us how you have approached the contact tracing discussion from your perspective.
Sure. So as you noted, EPIC is a nonprofit. We've been around for 25 years, focusing public attention on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues. And certainly this question of whether and how different localities might implement digital contact tracing is one of the most significant emerging privacy issues we've seen during the pandemic. As Kathryn mentioned, many of the proposals are looking at using different types of Bluetooth implementations if they decide to do contact tracing. The way that we look at this issue is first by starting, from a public health perspective, sort of acknowledging the expertise and interests of the public health officials, because there is definitely a concern among many in the privacy and technology oversight communities that there's a risk of kind of a solution in search, not a solution in search of a problem, but kind of a tech solutionism philosophy that there must be some magic widget that can fix this. And that may not be the case. It really depends on what public health officials ultimately decide. So whether a digital contact tracing system is usable by a public health authority, whether it's in a particular state here in the US or whether it's in a foreign country, is really going to depend on a lot of factors. As Kathryn mentioned, the traditional kind of shoe leather contact tracing method is really how public health authorities approach this component of a pandemic or epidemic response. And I think every public health official that's spoken to this issue has indicated that that doesn't go away. Ultimately, the manual contact tracing is an essential part of the public health response. And if usable at all, digital contact tracing is a supplement. So we start there, that this is a new potential supplementary procedure that some public health officials are considering. It shouldn't be implemented unless it's deemed to be necessary and useful for public health. But if it is implemented, the system needs to be clearly defined. We believe it needs to happen on a voluntary, not involuntary basis. That it needs to minimize to the greatest extent possible the collection of any personal information. The decentralization that Kathryn mentioned is critical to that. And also that any systems that it puts into place to protect privacy be provable, scalable, and robust. And it really is necessary to have independent oversight of these systems. So the Singapore app, for example, was developed in conjunction with their data protection authority and other independent oversight bodies. Unfortunately, here in the US, we don't have a federal data protection authority, so we're a little bit behind on that front. Another thing I'll note is that the actual implementation of these systems really can vary, and the devil is in the details. So if we talk even just about Bluetooth contact tracing, there's a difference between using the default built-in Bluetooth systems that most phones have and using a more sophisticated implementation of random rotating Bluetooth signals, which Apple has previously used in its Find My feature to enable basically an anonymous identification of missing devices. And so the way that this proposal would work is that your phone would create a random ID based on cryptographic methods every 15 minutes that would rotate, and your phone would keep a log of its historical IDs, but other phones around you would only ever see, the random ID that you're using at a given time, and that way, no one device or no central database sort of knows all of your IDs. And the reason that that matters is because there's actually a significant amount of sort of surveillance architecture built into our physical space that most people might not be aware of. There's actually a lot of devices out there in the world today that pick up Bluetooth signals and log them based on location. So if you were using a system for digital contact tracing that centralized a bunch of Bluetooth records, then it would actually be possible in a number of different instances for other entities to reverse engineer that data. So there's a significant risk of re-identification, and even with the Apple-Google system, there's a significant risk to any individual who is essentially announcing their status as COVID positive that it might be possible to sort of correlate their Bluetooth IDs with physical real space recording, which could potentially be paired with video. So I think there's a major risk, depending on the implementation, to the individuals who actually would be submitting positive test results in this system. There's also a number of security and other privacy and other misinformation risks with the systems, which is that how you implement the system, the notification of a positive test matters a lot, because there's a risk of essentially trolling or misinformation being submitted to the system if individuals can self-report so-called kind of yellow alerts. There's a possibility of malicious actors using that to shut down entire cities or localities. There's also a number of other potential ways to re-identify or learn information about specific individuals that have been discussed by Ed Felton and other researchers. So there's a lot of, like I said, devil's in the detail with the implementation, and we're yet to be seen how these devices or how these systems will actually be designed. The Apple-Google proposal is a framework. It doesn't actually, they're not actually creating the apps themselves. And so those apps would have to be individually vetted. The other potential issue is by having very many different apps for different localities, that might risk creating, again, more difficulty for oversight and uncertainty about the privacy protectiveness of any particular system.
Alan,
so it's a very complex problem.
Alan, have you looked, has Epic looked at other contact tracing solutions? We've referenced the one from Singapore, Traced Together, I believe it was. Have you looked at this, I mean, in the global context, aside from this proposal? We've spoken mostly about the Google Apple Bluetooth proposal.
Yeah, in Epic's recent statement, we did some sort of a bit of comparison between the Singapore model and the Apple Google model. The Singapore model uses some data centralization, but again, the benefit of their model is that their system was developed in conjunction with a data protection authority with independent oversight. And the decentralized model, again, poses its own risks if you also decentralize the notification process. The other issue that I meant to mention is that there is a concern about how the app is actually used by individuals. If individuals are treating a lack of notice by the app as some definitive proof that they haven't been exposed, well, that's not going to work, because that's not how traditional contact tracing works either, right? Public health officials conduct contact tracing, but it isn't the case that anyone who hasn't been contacted by a public health official is somehow free and clear. So there's a lot of need to educate the public around what these apps can actually do. And if there isn't adequate adoption of these apps, then the information that they generate is going to be much less valuable to both the public health authorities and individuals.
Well, I mean, it seems as though on the one hand, the companies that have announced this and other proposals seem to have taken a lot of precautions on the privacy front. They seem to be going out of their way to find systems that do not take location up or do not scoop location up automatically. But I guess, on the other hand, like, how valuable is this going to be? Is this just a pointless exercise? Because if it's voluntary, if people kind of put in what can opt out as opposed to opt in, then how useful will the whole notion be? And should we instead kind of put our focus back on the traditional form of contact tracing? Alan, go ahead and respond to that. And I'd love Kathryn's thought on that too.
I think that we definitely need to focus on traditional contact tracing. I think public health authorities are in the best position to decide whether digital contact tracing can actually be useful to them in supplementing, but traditional contact tracing is going to be essential for, as far as public health officials have said, for every locality. I think the question of adoption and whether these systems can work is actually closely tied with the privacy question, because I think there are a number of barriers to adoption in terms of people actually having compatible devices and people having access to the information about how to download them. But for the people that can potentially adopt, I think clear assurance and oversight of the privacy practices is essential to their being willing to adopt. So here's another situation where privacy and public health, I think, go together. And it really is essential to protect both interests.
Great. Kathryn, what are your thoughts on this point about, is it really even worth the effort to do these digital contact tracing proposals?
So I absolutely agree with Alan that digital contact tracing should in no way supplant manual contact tracing. And I also agree with his point that we need to consider the larger sociological impact of how are people going to interact with this app. I agree that the more privacy features we can put in place in any of these apps that are developed, probably the more willing people will be to adopt them. And that's important because if a wide percentage of the population doesn't adopt it, doesn't use the app, doesn't download the app, then it's not particularly useful. There's also a concern that perhaps you download your app, but you don't go take your phone around when you go outside. You have your phone turned off. All that means it's not useful. And then there's also the concern about testing. So maybe you have the app downloaded, but if we don't have widespread testing in place, then it really doesn't matter. And so you could be creating that sense of false assurance. Oh, I haven't been notified that I've been exposed, therefore I should just go out and live my life the way I do normally when we're not in the middle of a global pandemic. And so that could create a sense of false assurance that I think could lead to a second wave, essentially, as we reopen the economy, reopen society. But I also think that it is actually valuable to continue to go ahead with exploring the digital version of contact tracing. Certainly, it could be useful. It probably will never be. We will never get 100% verification that a significant percent of the population has downloaded. It will never be there with testing, but that doesn't mean it can't help supplement the contact tracing that's already in place. And I also think we need to be thinking forward. In the United States, we haven't had a lot of serious pandemics. Coronavirus is really the first time since the early 1900s that we've been dealing with an outbreak of disease on such a wide scale. But if you look overseas, especially in Asia, there have been several different outbreaks over the past couple decades in China and South Korea. And so that's part of the reason those governments responded differently than the United States did. And so just because we in the United States don't have the same history of outbreaks doesn't mean looking forward we shouldn't be thinking about solutions for the next one.
It's a great point you just made there, Kathryn, about East Asian countries being more attuned to this. Have they been more attuned to kind of the digital methods? I certainly recognize that may be an issue where China has its own versions of contact tracing, right? And they aren't as voluntary opt-in. Alan or Kathryn, have you observed sort of the use of technology by China in particular, and what concerns may arise from that the U.S. should take from that experience?
Did you want to take this, Alan, or should
I? Sure, I'll start. Just a few quick points. I think that look, the way China approaches many of these issues is just kind of at times fundamentally at odds with U.S. values, I think. I mean, China has done a lot in terms of, forcible quarantine, and lockdowns that I don't think we would ever be able to do in the United States. Certainly a lot more actions by the government that are, not voluntary, that are imposed on individuals without their control. And I believe that China did more digital contact tracing by collecting and centralizing data, specific location data. And location data, centralization of the data is problematic, especially when it's identifiable. Identifiable historical location data is some of the most sensitive data that exists out there. This is an issue that the U.S. Supreme Court has addressed in recent years in the Carpenter case. It's an issue of special concern, I think, for Americans, and so that's why we really counsel against any use of a technology like that here in the U.S. and any involuntary tracking.
Mm-hmm.
Alan's absolutely right. I think that China has had much more invasive methods of surveillance. And I think the important thing actually to keep in mind with this is not just the invasive methods they've used in response to coronavirus, but the amount of surveillance that goes on in China before COVID-19 was even a concern. So China has an expansive surveillance state. With the social credit score system, the government can already has access to and can control a lot of the data in people's lives. And so,
could you just speak a little bit more about the social credit system that you just referred to, just to kind of explain it basically?
Yeah, so the China's social credit score system essentially gives you a score for being a good citizen. And so it takes a wide variety of different factors into account, but there are things like, do you owe money? Did you break traffic laws? All these like little infractions. And so together they come together and they determine essentially whether or not you count as a good citizen. And depending on what your score is, people with bad scores, you ran through too many red lights, it can actually be very detrimental because we've seen people who were banned from traveling. They couldn't get on a plane, they couldn't get on a train because their credit score wasn't good. And your credit score is often available to other people. So in a low trust environment like China, I think a lot of citizens have latched onto the idea because there's this idea of, oh, this is how the government is telling me essentially whether or not I can trust my neighbor. And there's no way that would be, I think, tolerable by most people in the United States. But because systems like that were already in place in China, I think there's a general sense that the types of surveillance done during quarantine, essentially the forced quarantines, mandatory app download. I think in some cases people were required to take their temperature and send the information to local police authorities. And so all that type of surveillance is far, far more invasive than anything we've seen in the United States. I do think it's interesting to look at the different spectrum of responses in Asia, because obviously, China is a very authoritarian country, but we've also seen countries like Singapore and South Korea who have essentially jumped on the surveillance bandwagon much more quickly with Singapore's Trace Together app, issues where they were centralizing the data because they've been in situations where essentially they've needed to do contact tracing before.
So what is good or what is bad from those two nations, Singapore and South Korea's approach to this, right? Let's take the whole issue of contact tracing globally, whether non-digital or digital. What lessons can we learn from the way South Korea has used Trace Together and other methods? The way Singapore has used Trace Together and other methods, the way South Korea approached contact tracing apparently very aggressively early in trying to find and track people, because that's what people seem to be talking about now is like, we're actually going to have to do more of this going forward, at least until there's a vaccine, because that's the way we're going to, testing plus surveillance / contact tracing. And so again, what are some of the things we can learn if there are going to be approaches to this used? What's the good and what's the bad? Kathryn and Alan, if you don't mind.
I think there's some stories we can learn from both Singapore and South Korea and other countries in general. One is looking at adoption of the app in Singapore. I think it just they had trouble with people downloading the app, essentially making sure a significant number of the population adopted these methods. And so I think that just reinforces concerns about whether or not how effective the solution will be. I think another thing that we've learned from stories I've heard from South Korea and also India is that we need to be extremely careful about making sure that the identities of people who have COVID-19 stay private. There are stories of people in both India and South Korea where the information was released by the government, and they weren't really maybe releasing names, but I think in one situation I read about, they were releasing addresses, and that's obviously once you know someone's address, neighbors can easily say, hey, we know that person. And this led to all sorts of public shaming that were really quite horrific. And so we need to be extremely careful to make sure that we take the privacy of those individuals like very carefully.
Alan, before we get to you, Julian Sanchez has joined our discussion. Welcome, Julian. Thank you, and appreciate you persisting even though there are technical difficulties. We've been doing more than 24 of these webcasts. Now we're doing them every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern, and there's always some difficulty, right? There always is, right? There's always some buffering. And so one of the best advice we got from one of our early panelists on Broadband Breakfast Live Online is you got to lower your standards, right? You got to recognize there's going to be glitches and problems. So with that, let's actually turn to Julian. We've been talking with Kathryn Waldron of the R Street Institute and Alan Butler of Electronic Privacy Information Center. Julian, of course, you're with, senior fellow with the Cato Institute. Tell us a little bit about your work and the Cato Institute's work in this arena that we're discussing, digital surveillance, contact tracing, how that might be applicable to the situation we're in with COVID-19. So take it away, Julian.
Sure. Yeah. So Cato is a libertarian public policy institute. I, for a long time, have been working primarily on surveillance in the context of national security and FISA, foreign intelligence issues. But we have both a couple of colleagues and I do a fair amount of work on broader electronics and surveillance and privacy issues. And so, of course, from that perspective, one of the things that becomes very clear from the experience of studying that sphere is that authorities justified for one purpose tends to be co-opted for other purposes. So if you look at wiretapping in general, if you see hearings where wiretapping authorities justified, it's inevitably talking about things like terrorism and kidnapping and murder. But if you look at least on the criminal side, what wiretaps are actually used for, it's in the vicinity of 90% cases where the most serious offense is a drug crime. And similarly, if you look at some of the Patriot Act authorities that were passed in the aftermath of 9/11, I recall, for example, the so-called sneak and peek warrants, that is warrants that can be executed without notice, contemporaneous notice to the target of the search. At the time, the premise was, well, this was necessary because you can't tip off terrorists who might alert their the rest of their network. But again, overwhelmingly, these ended up being used for drug investigations. And so the pattern is when authorities that may be justified by a kind of a reasonable response to some extraordinary threat. There's an almost ubiquitous tendency for that to be used for other things. As long as there's a constituency for that authority, it tends to outlast the sort of justifying emergency that gave rise to it. And so, in the case of contact tracing, the way to prevent that, we think, is essentially architecturally. If you create, any kind of technical architecture for compiling sort of a centralized database, either of proximity or of location, you are going to create a constituency for preserving that architecture for a range of other purposes. If you deploy a protocol that is, for example, like the one that Google and Apple have been discussing, is decentralized and doesn't therefore sort of lend itself to the creation of a constituency, it's much more likely to go away when the crisis has passed.
Great. Thank you very much for those comments, and thank you again for for sticking with us and joining. We at Broadband Breakfast Live Online, we try to get a lot of different perspectives and views, and obviously you can't always get every perspective. We have a very libertarian panel, as it turns out, here to discuss this topic. And some of the wags are saying, well, in a pandemic, we're all socialists, right? I mean, the voices of traditional libertarian caution, no government involvement, kind of goes away a little bit. And so I do want to come back to the perspective that we are in a extreme global health emergency, a crisis, right? And so things are shut down, right? There are stay at home orders, right? There are things that would not be countenanced in another context that are countenanced in a pandemic. And so let's just come back to this general principle of contact tracing generally, right? I mean, it sounds on its face extremely violative, but on the other hand, it's really vital, right? I mean, do you, Julian, or do the others of you have any kind of concerns in principle with using such a technique, contact tracing, in a situation like we're in right now?
I mean, I would just note, contact tracing is not a thing that was made up for the purposes of COVID, right? This is something that for tuberculosis and HIV and other serious infectious diseases has been commonplace for a long time. And typically, manual contact tracing is done with the consent and participation of someone who's test positive for the illness or for the virus involved. And so, that's been a sort of vital tool for combating serious contagious diseases for a long time. And it's something that in general, people are usually willing to participate in for the interest of protecting others. I think maybe more willing in the case of something like COVID than something like HIV, where people may be more reticent about sharing information about sexual partners than just sort of people who shared airspace. So in principle, I don't think there's anything wrong with contact tracing, and certainly even as I think as a libertarian, you recognize that the fundamental legitimate duty of the state is to protect people from harm, to control externalities, and so you protect people's rights in this case. Sometimes by in an extreme situation doing more than you might otherwise, but to the extent again you can architect something in a way that is to the maximum extent possible voluntary and anonymous and doesn't lend itself to kind of mission creep. I don't think that's something libertarians should be opposed to. We should be opposed to, again, things being justified by emergencies, then being used to sort of constrain us in ways unrelated to the originating emergency.
Well, Alan Butler, I believe that your organization, EPIC, has had some experience with the contact tracing issue in recent weeks. It's been reported in Politico and Protocol that the long-standing executive director of EPIC, Mark Rotenberg, stepped down, and I believe that there was some discussion of having been infected and potentially not sharing that with members of the staff. Again, this has been reported in Politico and Protocol. I'm wondering if you have any comment or reaction to sort of the experience of contact tracing as your organization has experienced it on a very personal level in the last couple of weeks.
I mean, nothing really on a personal level, just to say that EPIC has been dedicated to, looking into these types of privacy issues since its founding, right? We've been around for 25 years looking at these issues, and we've been, as I mentioned earlier, particularly focused on the digital contact tracing issue since the proposals came out, over a month ago. And, we really believe that it is essential to promote the interest both of privacy and public health. And that, as many of us discussed before, I think begins with investing the public health resources where they're needed the most, which is in both the manual contact tracing methods and also in testing and the development of the vaccine. Ultimately, the public health officials need to drive that process. And to your earlier point, if digital contact tracing is going to be used, it should be done, with the determination by particular public health officials that it's actually going to be useful and necessary.
Mm-hmm. So from the perspective of of Epic, what are the things, what are the principles that should accompany contact tracing writ large? I mean, are there, we'll get to some that others have suggested here, but like, do you have a list of, this is the circumstances under which contact tracing should be used? You've just named one, obviously public health officials saying it's useful or necessary. What others might there be, Alan?
Sure. With respect to digital contact tracing specifically, the principles we laid out in a recent statement to the House and Senate oversight committees were that the system, any system adopted, be voluntary, that it minimized to the greatest extent possible the collection of personal information, that any system adopted to protect privacy be provable, scalable, and robust, that any system implemented for the pandemic be limited in period to the pandemic, to Julian's point. I think those are all essential, though not sort of comprehensive of every potential issue that might come up.
Did you mention anonymous? Was that one?
So minimizing to the extent possible the collection of personal information, and I think that's the reason why many of these proposals focus on the use of Bluetooth rather than location data tied to identifiers. Why the Apple Google system, for example, uses rotating random Bluetooth addresses versus persistent identifiers. That those are all contributions to minimizing any collection of personal information, as is having a decentralized versus a centralized model.
Right. Well, and this minimization principle, in some ways, this could give digital contact tracing a leg up on traditional, right? Because there's, at least I don't understand how you would minimize physical contact tracing. Someone saying, "Hey, you are exposed to someone who has COVID-19. This is when, this is, what we know about it." And we've all, I mean, I think, the scale of this is so immense that we all have coworkers, colleagues who have gotten this. And so we then go back and say, okay, well, when did I interact with that person? When did I interact with an environment that might have led to this? So let me ask Kathryn and Julian whether there are ways in which digital contact tracing could be preferable. Like there could be some benefits to the system that the Trace Together system, or the Google Apple system, or others. And let's talk about others if there are out there, how they might be preferable to kind of the status quo of contact tracing. Again, Kathryn and Julian, reactions to that.
So yeah, I think there are ways that digital contact tracing is preferable. And I think it goes back to that original, when it comes to manual contact tracing, you make mistakes. You don't remember everyone you've been in contact with. Your memory is faulty. You don't have the contact information for people. You didn't realize you were in contact with someone. And so in that sense, digital contact tracing is preferable in that sense. And as to other, you asked a couple times about other different types of contact tracing. I will mention that in addition to Google and Apple and Singapore's Trace Together, that there have been a couple different groups in Europe looking at both centralized and decentralized approaches. They haven't fully come out with a system yet, but there are other groups out there, just FYI.
Right. And one of the links on the web page where you may be watching this stream from, we've got resources, and one of them is a story from the New York Times, I believe was just today, that references a North Dakota-based program called Care 19 that, I don't know much about this other than it's referenced in this story, and it's been put together by some folks on behalf of the state, right? So I don't know again how prevalent this is, or are people basically thinking, well, Google and Apple are doing it, so let's stand back and see what they're doing.
In terms of some benefits of digital over manual, so think about a kind of standard case of how something like a manual contact tracing works. Someone who's ill and says, well, I was in a bar last night, and I don't know everyone who was there, so I can't tell you their names. So, but if you wanted to sort of pursue that, you would end up sort of having to invade, in a sense, the privacy of a lot of other people who may not have been exposed. Let's you go to the bar, talk to people who were there, talk to the bartender, try and get the names of everyone who might have been present, and then try to figure out, who was actually interacting with the initial patient for long enough that they need to get tested. So that involves if you actually, involves either not being able to do it because the person doesn't know the people he interacted with, as many of us every day, when it's not in a pandemic and we're under quarantine, interact with a lot of people whose names we don't know. And then if they do go through with it, again, it involves a lot of sort of ancillary leakage. It involves the authority doing the investigating, learning a lot about people who may not even be at risk. Whereas, and ideally you have sort of all sorts of processes in place so they're not.
Oh, Julian,
It looks like
sorry.
But it's a lot cleaner and faster and more efficient to be able to have, the technologist named Harper Reed has suggested that actually for the digital versions, contact tracing is, maybe actually not the right term. The sort of these decentralized sort of digital versions are maybe better termed something like exposure alerting or exposure notification, because it doesn't really involve someone doing the tracing. It's about sort of skipping, in a sense, to the goal, which is alerting people who are at risk that there are steps they should take.
Yeah, we got a comment here from Val Mead. It would give us even more reason to live in a bubble and avoid people we find unpleasant. Our information and life bubbles will become even more entrenched. I mean, that is in some respects the fear, right? We're entering this period of time when some voices are saying, reopen the states. There's going to be, rolling, expansive things more open. People still are saying, well, most restaurants won't be open. But this is always coupled with we need more testing and we need contact tracing, right? And so, it's a big question. And I in some ways, I hope this discussion can help us get to a question of, can we get to some digital tools, broadband related tools that will be preferable to, having every state's health department kind of beef up its array of traditional contact tracing. Thoughts on that point?
I mean, I think ultimately the public health authorities are going to have to beef up their actual contact tracing infrastructure, because I don't think digital contact tracing is there in terms of actually replacing or supplanting that system. It's always going to supplement. I mean, I think that there are advantages when it supplements, as Julian and Kathryn have mentioned, because memory is fallible, because there's just a lot of contacts that an individual wouldn't really be able to identify to a manual contact tracer. I know that there's also an issue, I believe in Japan, there was an issue recently where there was significant underreporting to manual contact tracers because there are certain places that people did not want to admit to having been. And you can imagine all sorts of examples of that, where a digital record may, is more complete and is less likely to be, especially if it's decentralized, doesn't necessarily expose that information. Now, there is a risk that, if I get an alert that I was in contact with a positive case at a particular date and time, then I may know who that person was because I may have a recollection of that. So there are a lot of risks associated with the systems. Mm-hmm. There are potential benefits, but I don't think that they can replace or supplant the traditional system.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Alan, and one additional point I would just make is that while I think digital contact tracing does actually have a lot to offer as a supplement, not all members of the population have a phone that will be compatible. And actually, I think it is some of the populations that are most at risk of coronavirus, older populations particular, that may not have a smartphone. And so if you don't have a phone that can download or use the app, then that places you outside the digital contact tracing system. And so in that sense, we're always going to need manual contact tracing as well.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. People, either don't have phones or don't have their phones on them all the time. Children can be carriers, and there's an age below which it's not that normal to carry a phone. So yeah, it's going to be a supplement. I don't think anyone's proposing ending traditional manual contact tracing.
So one of the links to the resources is an article that discusses, a post that Microsoft made about 7 principles for digital data tracking. I won't read all of them. I just want to read the first and 7th. First is obtain meaningful consent by being transparent about the reason for collecting data, its collection, and how long it is kept. And principle 7, delete data as soon as it is no longer needed to be emergent. What reactions do any of you have about this point about consent? How meaningful is consent? how easy is it going to be to say no thank you, or by contrast, is this going to be hidden and hard to find on your phone? Turn it on. And secondly, about the data and how long is it necessary, right? So how long is it contemplated that data of contacts will be stored by this proposal, Apple, Google, or by other proposals? If any of you have a familiarity with those, I'd love your reaction.
I mean, I would say it's essential that it be voluntary, not just on kind of general principle, but because to the extent that you are relying on people to voluntarily carry their phones around and have them turned on, they need to feel like this is transparent and they're comfortable with what is being done and understand why it's being done. If they feel like this is something that's being done without their consent, that they're in a non-transparent way, so they don't understand what's being done with the data, people can just turn their phones off or leave them in the house if they if they're worried about being tracked when they meet people. So you will dilute the effectiveness of contact tracing as a tool. But yeah, to the extent that the function of this is to notify people about risks so they can follow up, then that as soon as users are followed up and confirmed that they've been notified, that should be sort of as long as the data is kept. But again, right, the preferable architecture is just not to have that done sort of server side in the first instance. So you don't need to worry about deleting things.
Alan or Kathryn, do you have thoughts on those principles about consent and deletion?
I agree. It's absolutely vital that we have an opt-in system where it's transparent and easy to see what you're consenting to. I think that large tech companies have gotten a bit of flack and pushback over the past couple of years about data being shared with users not being, think about Facebook, with users not being aware of what data is being shared. And so if they want to essentially maintain public trust, then they will approach this, this Google and Apple will approach this being like, we want to be as transparent as possible, like every step along the way. And I think that's important, especially because there are so many calls for the government to essentially step in and have a response to COVID-19. I think that to some extent, the more we can encourage people to participate in a system that is opt-in, that protects privacy, the less likely we are to end up with some sort of government response that overreaches in response.
I also think it's important I agree with the points both Kathryn and Julian raised. I think that with respect to transparency and the agreement of users to use the app, I fully agree that it's essential that users feel confident that it's transparent and that the privacy is going to be protected, or else they're not going to use any of these apps. There is an advantage to these apps being run by public health authorities, because those authorities are subject to greater oversight and restriction than private companies. I mean, the reality is we don't have a comprehensive data protection law in the United States. We don't have a data protection authority. And so it's really, there's not a lot of explicit controls over what commercial entities do with apps on phones in the App Store. I mean, there's a lot of location data, surreptitious location data collection that goes on currently with apps, identifiable collection. I mean, really bad stuff, like the type that Epic and others have highlighted in our cases and complaints. And the public health authorities can't really get away with playing fast and loose with the rules in that way. They do definitely have to be upfront about what they're collecting, and I agree fully that data should be decentralized if possible, and any data that is collected by the authorities should definitely be deleted at the expiration of the pandemic, if not earlier.
Yeah, no, you've just raised a point that we really do need to touch upon, even if it is the last 5 minutes here, which is how does this discussion impact the broader question about a data privacy law that had been talked about before COVID-19 was in anyone's minds or bodies, and secondly, the kind of the infrastructure we're in which these have become surveillance. These phones are surveillance machines, right? I mean, and yes, we choose to be surveilled in certain applications because that is something that there is some value, but there's definitely leakage of data, right? And this applies both in the commercial setting as well as in the 9/11 context that Julian talked about earlier, where all of these uses for expanded authority aren't really the reason that was given for getting those authorities. So I'd like to get each of your thoughts, and maybe take a minute or two, and we'll get each of your thoughts on both the way the coronavirus will impact the broader privacy discussion, but also the usage of data, and whether we're going to see greater or greater freedom, if you will, for the tech companies to use data, or is this going to be a kind of a cautionary tale to start to minimize data collection? Alan, do you want to take this first, and then we'll go to Julian and Kathryn?
I mean, I think it will significantly impact the debate about federal privacy law going forward, in part because it's exposed a lot of the gaps in our current legal architecture or infrastructure. Even if you think beyond just contact tracing, all of a sudden everyone is relying on Zoom and these other technologies, and we look around and we realize, oh, there's not actually explicit federal oversight of their privacy practices. I mean, this is just a perfect example where if you don't protect privacy up front, you're not going to get adequate adoption, and the systems just aren't going to work because users won't be willing to rely on them.
Hard question, Alan, but are Apple and Google part of the solution or part of the problem when it comes to privacy?
I think it really depends on which part of the process you're looking at. I think with their digital contact tracing proposal, they appear to be moving in the right direction, and that they're pushing, they've created the architecture for a decentralized system and created the architecture that can potentially minimize the collection of personal data. How that actually gets implemented and applied, devil's in the details, so we'll have to see. But I think that they're taking steps in the right direction right now.
And when you bundle those together, you're asking about two companies with very different business models with respect to privacy. So maybe one may be more part of the problem than the other in terms of other contexts. I think in this context, very much the solution, insofar as I think, previously there was a lot of sort of loose talk about much more centralized location-based systems of the kind that Israel has rolled out, and some other countries have rolled out. And so in a sense, I think it's very helpful that they should step forward to say, wait, that's not the only model. We can do this in a different way that doesn't require, giving the government a detailed map of where everyone's been over the past 2 weeks or however long.
Julian, you probably have a different perspective than Alan on privacy legislation. What is your take on how this pandemic will impact that broader debate about privacy legislation?
I think in particular, this may sort of highlight for people the extent to which location information, which is collected by a lot of entities for a lot of purposes, is not really particularly well regulated or governed in the way that, let's say, telecommunications content information is. There aren't the same kind of clear rules about when that information can be sold or turned over. So the extent that this is, I think, focusing people on the fact that there's this data out there and the use of it is not that clearly regulated, I think that may build public support for some kind of framework. And my attitude is, first, for something like this, it might make sense to just have a kind of unified, clear federal standard, just because the conflict between a lot of different jurisdictions having different rules is, to my mind, the best kind of case for some kind of overarching federal rule. We tend to be sort of skeptical of regulation, but I'm not opposed to something that permits people to share and consent to the sharing of information if they believe it's in their interest. That doesn't make it a series of flaming hoops that you have to jump through, but that also ensures that people are not unwittingly having personal information used and shared without their consent. That's a kind of totally acceptable regulation in my view.
Great. Well, Kathryn, we'll give you the last word on the topic, and including general privacy legislation.
Well, I think that Alan and Julian both made really good points. And so if I could leave our viewers with maybe a couple thoughts. Number one being, we always need to be careful about changing legislation and creating precedents in a crisis, because I think people in general are typically a little more willing to give away freedoms in a crisis than they would otherwise. And it's often very, very difficult to get that rolled back. And then also, one more point I think that's important is that it really does matter when evaluating all these different types of digital contact tracing or other apps that may be out there, to look at the technicality of what's being implemented, how it's being implemented, because these questions, centralized versus decentralized, Bluetooth versus geolocation, is the data going to be deleted? Who is it? Who's looking at it? Where is it being held? All of this really matters when it comes to protecting your privacy.
Well, wonderful. With that, we're going to thank our panel. Remind you that we'll be back next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Our topic next week will be measuring and monitoring the health of broadband networks during the coronavirus, particularly including discussion of data caps. Thank you again. I'm Drew Clark, and thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.